Hi, and welcome to episode 15 of the Breaking, Building, and Belonging podcast. It is the memoir in the making that is continuing to be written, but also one that serves as a leadership podcast with food for thought for you as I reflect on the reality of my life and the characters in it. So I ask you to join me for this episode. Last section of the book that we shared was called Panics, Pariahs, and Professors. It was about my grandmother, and this one is about my grandfather. And we call this one Commendations, Chips, and Chits. And it starts out with a Plato quote. As quoted by the Italian Renaissance thinker and humanist Leonardo Bruni, the measure of a man is what he does with power. So the strong women in my life have supported me through the journey. They were there for me when I needed encouragement, and they confronted my weaknesses and imperfections. They were a boost to an ego otherwise decimated by circumstance and self-flagellation. Leaving any of these ladies out of the story would do a great disservice to the champions they were and are. And I'm going to continue to share more about them as the tale unfolds. But what I'd really like to do right now is paint a portrait of a male champion in my life, my grandfather, a man who taught me how to be full of what I like to call be full of chit, which is curiosity, humility, intentionality, and teachability. As we continue our journey, I want to talk about this World War II veteran and how he lived a life, his grit as a gritty hero, not just from World War II, but the game of life. I've seen the documents typed on an old school typewriter by some nameless clerk, doubtless doing their duty for our country. The paper, worn, brittle, paper that was once durable, once able to withstand being struck so hard by each off-kilter element of typeface, each record an aging survivor of the decades, stuffed in a drawer or a filing cabinet, God knows where. But when it came out, it said Army of the United States, honorable discharge, 52nd Bomb Squadron, battles and campaigns, air offense Europe, Central Europe, Normandy, Northern France, Rhineland, decorations and citations it talked about, European, African, Middle Eastern Service Medal, Good Conduct Medal. And I recall looking at the bottom of those papers and seeing the mark of this man I'd seen on hundreds of other documents, from checks to rental agreements. Its signature etched at the bottom of the document, scrawled by a much younger man who must have felt enormous relief that he would get to go home. I imagine he must have been grateful as he signed that document. He likely appreciated that none of the bombs he attached went off while he was handling them. And Pepop must have been relieved that none of those that the enemy intended for him and his buddies hit them while they were sleeping in their barracks in England or France. He must have counted his blessings that none of the planes that came in full of holes and live explosives with the bombs still attached put an end to both his military career and his young life before that moment. He must have laughed when his Good Conduct Medal was issued, knowing all the poker he played and his drinking with the boys in his unit was not included in the criteria. To add to our family's honors, I also had an uncle. That uncle received both the Purple Heart and the Bronze Star for saving his captain at the Battle of the Bulge. He and my grandfather were best friends, but they served in different parts of the war. They grew apart later in life due to some of the family disputes I've alluded to earlier in this story. And it's a shame because my uncle, really my great uncle, he left us many decades before Pepop. I take solace in the fact that that those two are now sharing a Miller High Life beer up in heaven together. And with them, shaking her head, is the lady that you just met in a couple of chapters ago, Graham, my grandmother. I'm sure she is labeling them Stunad regularly as well, and giving them new heavenly nicknames. When I think of these two, especially on certain holidays like Memorial Day, I'm proud to reflect on their service to our country and thank them for it. I hope I don't offend anyone, but my Pepop's military service is not the service I am most thankful for. I'm most thankful to Pepop for the service to his family, the way he got up every morning, put on shoes that were often too tight and too worn on his broken and aching feet, and went to work every day to help support his impoverished family. I was lucky enough to live with this man when I was little, when I was a teenager, and again as a young adult. I watched him hobble on those feet and go to physical jobs. His work was unlike mine. It involved driving, moving, hauling, and standing for hours. Every time he got up from his chair or bed, I heard him suck in the breath and utter a slight curse at his feet that sought to betray him. I also watched him walk to work later in life after his eyes gave out and he could no longer drive a beer truck or a garbage truck. After turning in his license, he embraced his true love, the other one, not my grandmother, to make a living, and that was cooking. Yet even that was a sacrifice. Beyond the walking to work, when Bebop arrived, he worked for people who did not give him a raise in the decades that he served in their kitchen. Each week, he paid for the pizza he brought home to us. A charitable contribution never came, an expense that was the mere cost of ingredients for the owners, but they couldn't part with it. Even on holidays, Peapod paid out of his meager salary for his family's supper. Occasionally, those employers would give him a complimentary bottle of wine at Christmas as a bonus, but the rest of the time, it was pay as you go. And I saw him sacrifice another way too. He had to save his creativity for home. He can make a gravy, or as non New York Italians call it, spaghetti sauce, that was second to none. Yet he had to make the sauce their way. He had to make the sausage and peppers their way, hobble home, and then he got to cook for us. So, as discussed, years before his Italian restaurant job, his dreams of doing it his way were dashed when a failed attempt to relocate and reconcile with that brother in law and start his restaurant ended in further family separation. Oh, it was a Sopranos level of Italian family infighting and the collapse of the former buddy's business shortly after it started. I think he tried to make a go of it. I probably mentioned that. And we ate all the profits, even as he tried to serve New York style hero sandwiches to Titusville, Florida. They'd say, "What's a hero? We believe in sub sandwiches here with extra mayo." So, the fantastic thing about my grandfather is that he took it all in stride. Even in times of distress, my grandfather is famous for his colorful phrases, belted out in a half chuckle like, "Your sister's ass. Ain't that some shit? And you gotta be kidding me." Yeah, that was my peep up. Utter a curse and move on. Thank God for what you do have and move on. Yeah, he's a study in both chit and grit. He even takes the same attitude when discussing his time in the war. He's not sad, no solemn recollection of planes flying in with a live bomb hanging off a tattered wing, no urge to come in closer and listen to what he did to save the day. Nope, that wasn't Peepop. When he was asked what he did in those situations, he laughingly said, "Oh, you kidding? We shit our pants and prayed to God the damn thing wouldn't blow us all to hell." I think his resilience started from an early age. Pepop got one of his first injuries to his feet as a teenage driver driving a milk truck in New York City. I think he was about 12 or 14. And when he was a teenager, they used these giant blocks of ice to keep the milk cool. He dropped one of those mothers on his young foot. And that's probably where all the cursing started. It never stopped. Um, you know, what's really amazing about this guy is that after he broke that foot, he kept on delivering the milk. He kept on going until when he got home, they had to cut him out of his shoe. And I also might want to mention that when he got to finally retire, he lived alone in a second floor apartment and walked to the store well into his late 90s. He was tough. He was tough. And he went from driving that ice truck to driving a beer truck, driving a garbage truck. And he was a Teamster the whole time he lived in New York, all the way out to when he moved out to Long Island. He built that house out there and he moved his family when it was still considered the country. I have pictures of him and the family picnicking out in the woods. My mom and triplet sisters and I moved into that house with my grandparents, with my aunts and uncle when I was a toddler. And we lived there with houses popping up all around us, but still adjacent to some woods until I was about 9. When I was finishing third grade and preparing to enter the fourth, we moved to Florida and attempted that failed reconciliation with the brother in law and the foray into the restaurant business. And so we ended up on the space coast of Florida years before the first space shuttle launched. That reunion failed, the restaurant sank into the swamp, and our lives as Floridians began. Pepop left the Teamsters, never drove again. He never went to test for his Florida license. And at that point, when he was close to my age now, as I write this, what he said about it was, I've been driving all my life. I'm done. From that moment forward, he cooked and he walked. And he worked well into his 70s, well after he should have. He worked at several restaurants and he was beloved by all of his coworkers. He was known as hardworking, dependable, who made people laugh at every single restaurant and eatery he worked at, including the one who could not spare the free pizza. And they love him. He loves them. He celebrated birthdays and milestones there into his final years because he didn't bear a grudge. He only held memories of laughter and crazy times with them. That is who he was. And no matter his age, he never stopped caring for those around him. What was his was yours. He gave it, whether that was a roof over your head, food, money, or time. Until the last few years of his life, the dynamic never shifted. He was helping family when they needed it. Some of the same ways, the non monetary ways that he did when I was a kid. For a while, I was blessed enough to have my turn to pay him back. I'd send him a small supplementary allowance twice a month for many years. I had a rule. Hey, Pete, when I get a raise, you get a raise. Every time I talked to him on the phone, we had the same ending to our short and sweet conversation. He would say, Hey, John, thanks for all you're doing. I really appreciate it, man. And I would say, Pete, it's just my turn. I can never do for you what you did for us. And I would close it with, I love you, Pete. And he would say, Take care, kid, which roughly translates into, I love you, kid, in Brooklyn Teamsterese. So when I look back now, I have a hilarious image in my mind of a cartoonish, slightly more balding version of me giving myself a Homer Simpson slap on the forehead and exclaiming, Doe! As I think back on just how many things I got wrong about this man as I was growing up. For instance, when he gave me advice, I was arrogant enough to think He was naive. If I'm sincere, although I worshiped this man, occasionally I thought that Pepop, who was a brilliant storyteller, was more full of shit than he was of chit. And this was the most true one time when he gave me the following advice. He said, "Listen, Johnny, don't be no better than nobody, and don't be no worse." Well, as a brash young person, I remember thinking he wanted me to be ordinary and not stand out, not try to achieve great things. And my developing brain could not grasp what he meant as I helped him create garlic-filled culinary delights from the stove-side perch of the kitchen chair. While I was anxious to hear his advice, I did not listen as well as I could have, even as he would share his working man's wisdom with me. I always had a good bit of my arrogant, "I'm going to make it out of this hood" filler firmly in place. That kind of chip develops early when you feel your life is not as good as those around you. Your shoulder gets heavy at a young age when you're trapped in comparisons with the kids who have the trademark surfer wear, the Levi's, and they live in middle class neighborhoods. You wear Salvation Army clothes. You help your grandfather cook with salvaged veggies from the Publix dumpster. But I know now that that was all an unnecessary narrative. I told myself in vain to be the hero of my poor pearl pity party story. I now know that I had everything that was most important right there, exemplified in a man who worked his ass off to help us to have a lovely Sunday dinner and then came home and cooked it with very few complaints and an abundance of joy and laughter. I now know what he was trying to tell me. Here's my rewrite of his advice with the knowledge that I have now and without that chip on my shoulder. The rephrase of, "Listen, Johnny, don't be no better than nobody and don't be no worse," might sound something like, "Johnny, the key to life is to be full of chit at all times, Johnny. Be curious, humble, intentional, and teachable. Do not compare yourself to others. Do not try to outdo them. Do not think you are lesser than them. Just be who you were created to be and love others as you would yourself along the way. Oh, and pass me that oregano. This needs much, much more oregano. Always more, never enough. Like covering the top of the dark, rich sauce in a pasture of that green shit."